Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Vivid Earth. This is Anina, and I have with me today the pleasure of having SG Anon again with us, who always is such a phenomenal researcher, analyst, truth speaker, and patriot. And he provides a whole different perspective, I think, on what's happening in the world. And it's always really rewarding having him on. And I look forward to this discussion. How are you, SG?
Doing well, Anina. Thank you for having me back. It's good to be here.
Yeah, what an exciting time to be alive. I keep saying it, but it's like really unprecedented times. And we see, I think you mentioned it in one of your posts as well, the destruction of the deep state in real time. We really are seeing it in real time.
Yes, we are, and that cannot be understated, right? Or overstated, excuse me. This entire period that we've lived through the last 4 years primarily, but going back as early as 2016, has been all about dismantling the age-old, quite literally, power structures that have governed the movement of commerce, the movement of population groups, the movement of political power, where that type of power, excuse me, and military clout is concentrated all around the planet. And in the last 4 years, especially, there's a lot of people like yourself and others on broadcasts like this that have been tuning into understanding the broader war, the broader picture here, the shadow war or silent war, as Q calls it online, for control really of the destiny of mankind and the directionality of the world. And so now we are seeing that silent war becoming very overt in some regards. And I believe from here, it's only going to escalate. This is a really exciting time to be alive, but it's also a time to pay very close attention because whatever remains of that deep state opponent that you referenced a moment ago has now no choice, no time left with which to play around. They have to respond, and they're going to have to respond in a multilateral or in a civilization altering capacity if they're able to.
Indeed. On that note, is there anything that you see potentially on the horizon? I mean, we're dealing with an animal that's been cornered, and animals being that are cornered do desperate things, right? So what do you see potentially could be happening in the background? And I just always feel that the White Hats have rehearsed this and prepared for this for such a long time that whatever it is, they kind of have looked at all scenarios. Um, what do you think? Is there anything to be concerned about that, with these desperate attempts to stay alive by the deep state?
Well, the only the only concerns I guess that I would have with respect to that would be rogue factions. Excuse me, I'm dealing with a throat issue here recently in recent days. Um, when we look at the intelligence community, for example, right now their budget, their dark budget, their off-book money is being laid bare for the world to see in slow and methodical form. It's going to accelerate through this process with Doge, the various audits that agency is undertaking inside the U.S. government, inside aid programs, both foreign and domestic, distribution of monies, grants, things of that nature. So that can drive those rogue elements to be very, very concerned, like you said, with their existential survival and to do dumb things. And so the last time that we saw such a concern sort of manifested out, maybe is the wrong way to say it, but it's what comes to mind right now for the world to see, was during 2020, early 2020, during the last year of President Trump's first term, where we saw the biological warfare attack known as COVID-19 that struck the entirety of the planet. It was literally a WMD attack against the entirety of the population groups of the world, each in their concentrated nation state and regional spheres of influence. It would not surprise me if we were to see some sort of an event along those lines or of that caliber attempted again, perhaps earlier in this particular Trump presidency, because of the pace that we are going with the dismantling, with the auditing, with the showcasing out what's actually been happening here. And so we have to, fall back and remember that it's only been in very recent history, about 9 to 10 weeks ago, that we saw a number of nuclear source materials vanish without a trace here in the United States of America. They weren't large quantities of those materials, but the materials themselves were radioactive in nature. At least in the U.S. Example of this, the shipping container that was transporting these materials was found damaged and empty, and there's not been a successful investigation or publicizing of any sort of progress with respect to those investigations and finding that material. We had two other events happen within about 10 days of each other. After that, one of them in Spain, if I'm not mistaken, and the other one in France. And so understanding that, a radiological or a nuclear style event, Cuban Missile Crisis essence style event, is certainly a play card that they've used in days past. Understanding that the biological component is a play card that they've used in days past. And remember, we're not looking for direct translation when we analyze how this deep state opponent functions. They utilize the essence, the general spirit of whatever they've done before to come around again, right? When we saw the attacks on the Twin Towers on 9/11, 2001, blamed on aircraft at the time, that particular modality thematically had been used for 30 plus years at that time, going all the way back to the Richard Nixon administration here in the United States of America, to be a channel, essentially a harbinger for some sort of terroristic act. And so we saw the same thematic essence applied there, but at a much grander and a much larger scale. When we look at biological attacks, the same is true. Anthrax going all the way back to the first Bush administration, the biological terrorism component being a main driver of Western world propaganda and Western world public opinion throughout the 2000 and 2000 teens decade, all of the way up until of course of 2020, when we saw the biological warfare attack known as COVID. So a radiological event, just as a hypothetical example, could satisfy both the nuclear component as well as the biological component, would certainly be cause to lock down a society, to attempt to circumvent and overthrow a duly elected president by causing a critical national emergency or even an international catastrophe. We saw just in recent days, I think it was about 72 or 96 hours ago, the Kiev regime in Ukraine flying drones into the containment zone at the Chernobyl nuclear site in northeastern Ukraine, and then attempts to blame that on Moscow. Nobody in their right mind believes that Moscow would do that, because the site literally sits almost right on the border with Russia, where thousands of their own people are concentrated. So it makes absolutely little sense for them to do that, especially in an aerial manner, because the Russians could simply stampede across the border and possess the entirety of the plant if they really wanted to destroy it. So we have the attempt here again, and it's not the first one, but it's probably not going to be the last either, where we're attempting to ignite some sort of radiological catastrophe or some sort of nuclear source adjacent catastrophe or event here in the world, attempting to destabilize the situation. And I'm only expecting attempts like that and other attempts towards large-scale civilization terrorist attacks to escalate as we go through a period where we're deconstructing the bureaucracy of the federal government in the United States, and we're also realigning power structures around the rest of the planet and attempting to not feed the war machine, but in fact to turn the war machine's funnel off. I apologize, Miss Anina. You're on mute, I believe.
Sorry, I've got some dogs barking in the neighborhood, and I thought it might be disrupting, so I put myself on mute. Yeah, very, very interesting. And I think that middle management that is kind of left of the cabal can be quite dangerous, right? Because their motivations are actually different. For them, it's, the greed, their way of life that they fear losing. And it's, every layer of that cabal cake has kind of slightly different objectives in a way. So yeah, it could be quite dangerous. We'll see what happens. Positive, we're not going to see any serious, but there may be, a scare event. Who knows? But we will not speculate, and we will just, envision a positive outcome. I find just that, the timing of the whole Fort Knox audit so interesting. It definitely, for me, is building up a certain narrative in the public's minds, desensitizing them for what's to come. And who knows what's going to happen when they open up that place. I mean, I think they're already on site, isn't it? So, but I haven't heard anything back. But it's interesting that, they say there's 81.5 metric tons, yet the US Mint reports 4,603 metric tons. And when you look at the gematria of that, it actually boils down to 17. Like so many other things. I mean, we've had so many 17 comms of late, that it's hard to miss. But I think that's going to be a big one. What do you think is going to happen when they audit that place? Do you think it's going to be empty? we know we've heard a lot about, the gold being taken back from the Vatican. This was years ago, or 650 planes flying it back to the US. I've heard of obviously other places that it's stored as well. What do you think is going to transpire from all of this?
Well, it's interesting, and I'd like to caution the audience and say on this particular segment, it would be pure speculation because this is the grand secret, right? This is one of the major things that has been done to the peoples of the United States and by extension, the peoples of the world through that particular heist that occurred in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so, with respect to what they're actually going to find, it would be difficult to say. It would not surprise me if they found a certain quantity, perhaps a small quantity of gold, but nothing like the inflated numbers claimed by both the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. In this period of time, I think one of the things we're going to have to prime the public and the general population of the Western world into accepting and understanding is that we have to move back towards a currency system and an economic ecosystem that has a basis of value. There has to be some amount of standard here. There has to be some amount of agreeableness or agreement between two nation states on how they're going to conduct trade and how they're going to internally value their own economic landscape for admittance to the international sector. And so a great deal of the population groups in the Western world have been coming around to this idea that maybe the current operational system in the economic sector and the financial markets is not the best. It poses great risks. It certainly has a tremendous vulnerability if the wrong people are in charge at the very top of those centers of power and influence. And we've seen that happening certainly over the last 4 to 6 years. But I would say, going as far back as the 1980s with respect to what's actually been happening with the gold. It would also not surprise me if we were to go in there and find that there was no gold and that there was a tremendous lie and a deception that had been heaped onto the peoples of the United States since at the very least the Reagan administration. And if that were the case, we would have to find, or we would have to enter into, maybe is a better way to say it, a new dynamic of conversation surrounding our financial landscape. How can we possibly have value here in the United States if we don't have anything that secures that value, that secures that wealth? Also, where is the money that the American people have made and produced and generated here in the world? What has been going on with respect to our national treasures, and what other vaults may have been heisted or may be overinflated or perhaps just straight out lying on their balance sheets with respect to the population groups, not only in the United States, but the entirety of world markets, because world COMEX markets function primarily on what nation states report as far as their actual holdings and their estimated usage and their actual, it's sort of like A versus T, actual versus theoretical usage and what those needs are. So this could go a couple of different ways. I'm not anticipating them to find a fully stocked gold reserve and repository inside Fort Knox, though it would certainly be a pleasant surprise if they did, because that would help us, I think, facilitate right into the revaluation internally inside the United States in a much more rapid fashion. But I just think, based on the way that these events have seemed to play out over the last 4 to 5 years, it seems much more likely that we're going to have some hard realizations and some hard truths about what actually happened to the financial livelihoods, the substance and the sustenance of we the people here in the United States before we can move into how do we fix this problem.
Hmm. Very, very interesting. I think, if it is found empty or almost empty, that may have a significant.
I apologize, Miss Anina. I think we're experiencing an audio disruption. May have had an impact, I think was the last thing we could hear clearly.
I was just saying, it's interesting because if Fort Knox is empty or almost empty, this is going to have a significant impact of the dollar. But maybe this is all planned. Maybe, do you think? I mean, I like to speculate and I like to connect dots. It's not based on fact necessarily, but if there's almost no gold, it's going to affect the dollar. The dollar might crash because of that, because everyone will drop the dollar like a hot potato. And we kind of know it potentially has to happen for the new financial system to be brought in, and potentially for the treasury note to be released in its place. But I'm excited and curious. And then to top all of that, Elon and Doge, obviously, they said that with all the savings that they're looking to make, which is projected to be 2 trillion odd, they could potentially send $5,000 checks to all 79 million tax-paying households, which, I mean, they're already building that narrative as well. So is there something, a big crisis that's going to happen before everything will be sort of, the day will be saved, so to speak? Any thoughts on that?
You know, it's difficult to say. We expected a financial crisis to happen sometime during the Biden administration simply because it needed to fall on the head of the deep state with
Yes.
respect to causality and correlation. And I think that we saw a great deal of that, of course, with the realignment of trade blocs around the world, the redefinition of a lot of the behavior between those nation states inside those blocs, many of them having very large amounts of reserves and natural resources, things like gold, precious metals, certain minerals, rare earth minerals that are important for industry and modern convenience and lifestyles. And yet that did not occur publicly in the way that a lot of us were sort of expecting it to. And so now we're into this period, just a couple of months almost, or just a few weeks, really, about a month or so into this first Trump administration, or excuse me, this third Trump administration here for the world to see. And we're moving through a period very, very rapidly where we're uncovering tremendous amounts basically of wrongdoing, of criminality, of mismanagement, malfeasance, certainly deception on balance sheets, certainly deception with where money has been going. And so I'm looking at this as a very potential landscape for some sort of blame to still fall on the Manchurian Biden administration, but to be unearthed by the Trump administration. This would position Trump in a way where he could sort of save the day, so to speak, with respect to some sort of beginning of a liquidity crisis or concern in Western markets. We know that those Western markets have been firming themselves up, knowing that this administration was going to come for at least the last 8 or 9 months now, when they were unable to throw him in jail and unable to bankrupt him out of existence, and then unable to kill him. I believe a great deal of the opponents that perhaps remain on the game board resigned themselves in some fashion, and maybe they're going to remain opposed and maybe they're not. That's really the essence of the question here. What kind of financial landscape is going to shape up as a result of the policies that we're now seeing implemented at scale and certainly at a very rapid, almost blitzkrieg style pace here inside the United States? I think it's very possible that we have a brief period of economic instability and uncertainty, perhaps in response to an audit like that of Fort Knox or other gold repositories here in the USA, understanding that perhaps there's not full faith and credit anymore, right? Backing the U.S. government, the promise from the FDIC, backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. In other words, not backed by gold, not backed by any tangible or real asset of value, quite literally backed by our word, but we still have all of these reserves, and so that makes our word good. If we were to see those reserves removed and the full faith and credit fall out of taking our word for it, so to speak, then we could see a very brief but very intense economic crisis here in the U.S., perhaps necessitating the introduction of a better way of doing things. We saw the inverse of this happen in 1932, 33 with FDR and the New Deal and all of these things that came about from the legislative bodies and from the pulpit of the president in response to the depression that began in 29. So we could see an inverse of that happen in a relatively quick period. But again, without being a financial advisor and without a great deal of clarity, because these events are now happening in real time. In other words, we're going to hear about updates on these very topics in the next 24, 36, 48, 72 hours. It is truly difficult to prognosticate.
Muted again. There is, of course, also some rumors of thousands of gold bars secretly being moved from London to New York. We also know I think it's JP Morgan, has a massive underground vault as well in New York. Fort Knox hasn't been audited in 50 years. They've had kind of a micro audit, if you will, which really means nothing if they only audit 6% of the actual stock of gold. And so I don't know. It seems to be building up to something very interesting, but we'll see how it plays out. They seem to kind of string this out a little bit, so we'll see what happened. And of course, we saw the big storm happening in around, what was it, Kentucky? I don't know, can't remember where Fort Knox is located. I think it's Kentucky. Huge storm. that they also try to keep, Doge team out for as long as possible. So that's interesting. And then also Kash Patel coming into the fray, seemingly possibly confirmed by tomorrow. It's taken long enough, though. So I'm just wondering why this timing. I just ask why, and I just try and connect the dots with everything that I see, because it is a big sort of show playing out in front of us, and everything is perfectly timed. And of course, things do happen. There's always a spanner in the works somewhere, or the deep states throw a wrench at them, or these things happen. But for the most part, it's a very carefully scripted plan playing out in the public arena, possibly already. All these things have already happened in the background. This is just for the public to kind of know what's going on in a very sort of carefully timed manner. You can't come out with everything at once. That's why there's like so much coming out every day, but again, not too much that things can get sort of swallowed by other news. So everything needs kind of its moment in the sunlight for it to come out and be disclosed. But I find the timing of this whole operation quite interesting, how things are sort of rolling out. And as we said, this year has been nothing but slow. So I think they're cramming in as much as they possibly can to make sure that certain things doesn't fall out of public view, that it's still getting the attention that it deserves in its own right, What are your thoughts on that?
I think my thoughts on that are with respect to, moving things through and getting the attention where it needs to be. Yes, we are moving through a period of time where there is a bit of pantomime. There's been pantomime going on for, at least 7 years now at this particular point. I purport to say probably closer to 10 or 12 years. I mean, yet it does have to still be digestible and has to be a logical sequence of events, a logical progression of awakening, for lack of a better expression, for the general public that still has not seemed to come around. We're talking about military grade level brainwashing that we're attempting to undo and revert here in this process. And a lot of people that are following a show like this are going to be saying, are you serious? We've been waiting so long. If they can't come around, just leave them behind. But we cannot do that either. We're talking about 30 to 35%, maybe more, of the general population groups still in the Western world that are still slow to acknowledge the deeper truths here, the deeper combination of corruption, what actually happened here with Satanism, what actually happened here with pedophilia, what actually happened here with the organized sell-off and heist by the Rockefeller family in particular of tremendous amounts of U.S. gold from 1974 to 1991. What happened with George Soros and how the collapse of the Soviet Union actually occurred and what was done to Russia in the days, weeks, and months that followed that. These are topics, and that's just a small cross-section, right? We didn't even talk about Epstein Island in that particular example section, but that's just a small cross-section in what we're actually dealing with, trying to get people to come around to understand that it's all unified, that it is all coordinated, that there is, in fact, a wheel and a chain, and it serves itself all around the rest of the planet, and you can actually go and find the connecting junctions, the nodes, the gears that make those criminality complexes and those black budget projects and all those other things that you would lump into that sort of umbrella that make them go round and round and move the world forward in the way that they've always sought to do. And so that is the effort that's now being made here, where we have this second visible but third actual Trump administration here in the world. We're moving at literally lightning speed on major issues relating to mismanagement of money, corruption, bribery, incestuous relationship between politicians and special interest groups, for example. And we're only going to, I think, take that into a much more accelerated level because now the soil has been primed. The public has been exposed to a period of time where a large amount of them has organically awakened and is able to help buffer the remainder as they wake up through this process. And we're only going to be going faster, not slower. And it's going to get more difficult and perhaps a little bit more dramatic for individuals to come around and conquer that military grade mind control that they've been exposed to all of their lives.
Yeah, and you had an interview recently. I think the guy was James Grunberg, and he said something very interesting that I totally resonate with. That, because of this thing that everyone got in the arm, and they can actually control some of these minds via the frequency, the 5G towers, the microwave towers. And this is why we're seeing an increased level of cognitive dissonance that is beyond what is reasonable. We see it at a completely elevated level coming from seemingly intelligent people. And, Trump derangement syndrome hitting an all-time high, and yet it makes no sense. It's like, do they not even watch what's happening every day, what they are revealing, what they are disclosing, what this administration has done in just 1 month? Are they just completely blind to that? And so that makes sense. It's completely beyond any reason, because if there are frequencies that manipulate the minds of the people who receive these things, um, it's plausible for them to be still. So there is a sort of a major polarity happening at the same time. We have a lot of people waking up, yes, sort of in this middle band, but on the upper band, and I, see it here in South Africa as well, with very intelligent people, top of the game in business, major CEOs of advertising companies and groups, and they just have no idea, and they just, the way that they respond to anything about Trump is just beyond what is. It's just, there's no reason or rhyme. So I think that's a real possibility, and I really resonated with what he said.
Well, I mean, let's break that down for just a moment here. We would have to acknowledge that that is both real and probably extremely plausible in this situation in time, because what was the purpose of the transhumanistic AI agenda to begin with? That was the combination of man and machine and the complete subjugation and removal of free will and free thought. So you would have to have the ability to externally and remotely control the electric neurochemical processes, perhaps is the best way to explain it, that happen inside the body and inside the brain that lead to what we call thought, right? If you look at a brain under an encephalograph or any sort of PET scan, and you have an individual thinking about certain things, the color blue, the color red, certain music, things of that nature, it produces different electrical and neurochemical combinations inside the brain. And so if you could master those codexes, if you could understand how to interrupt those processes and redirect them for your own devices, you would literally be as close to God as you could be here in this physical world. And that has always been the angle of this deep state opponent from their occultic lens at the very top. They believe themselves to be essentially the rightful heirs of this planet from a standpoint of evil, not from good. And so there is this constant desire to get back at God, to be like God, and to one day conquer God and conquer God's creation here in the world. And this particular agenda, again, the transhumanistic digital slavery, fourth industrial reset, I guess is the best way to say it, was always the goal to accomplish that. So voice of God technology, for example, exists and has existed for a long time. You can actually have a situation arise here in the world due to the types of technology and capability that these secret technological off-site, off-book programs have had access to. You can actually send combinations and codes of frequencies directly to an individual, to a person, and you can harmonize those frequencies with that person's overall bioresonance field. It's called a bioresonance factor, and what you're able to do is augment their thought processes by way of frequency. It's exactly what you just described a moment ago. Imagine how much more effective such a process like that would be if you were able to talk someone into injecting the very equipment inside of their body needed to do exactly that. And I believe we've seen a number of those situations occur, unfortunately, here in the world over the last 5 years. We have numerous videos of graveyards, individuals that took these particular injections and then passed away, where their bodies within the graveyard, interred in the ground, are emitting Wi-Fi bands that can be connected to. So looking at what we're dealing with, again, it has to be a completely free will process. That's how God operates. That's how this world is made for us. We're literally so free that we can choose our own bondage, and we can hold ourselves there if we so choose to. Granted, no one out there would certainly do that consciously, but that is something that we have the ability and the access as created beings here in the world to do. So the free will component must override whatever has come within the body or come against the body or against the mind, not just the conditional and socio-programming mind control, but also any literal interaction or physiological interaction that may be occurring at that cellular and pre-cellular levels.
Yeah, very, very interesting. 2 points that I just want to touch on. Yes, the graveyard tests have been done, there's actually a Bluetooth signal being picked up from each, a unique Bluetooth signal from every single person. I've actually seen people with me testing it. Like, we had a gathering in a hotel, and small gathering, and the person was saying, oh, there's somebody that got the shot amongst us. It turned out it was one of the waiters. But that's how accurately you can pick it up. You had the software on his phone, he could pick it up. Now, what if each person that got the shot, right, their details on a database, right? So they have a unique barcode. They received that particular shot that from that particular batch. So it's identifiable. So you can actually through that person would then have a unique Bluetooth signal. So that voice of God technology can be targeted at specific people as well in that way. Just a thought that came up.
It absolutely can. And to close that segment off, I'd like to highlight for the audience that is, I believe, one of the ways where we will be able to go back and trace who the actual criminals here really are, what actually happened here in the world. This was a combination of, literally hundreds of millions of little gears all turning around the planet to put the screws to this particular agenda of transforming and globalizing essentially the world and inaugurating this so-called age of evil. And we saw that interrupted, of course, by the first election of President Trump in 2016, taking office in 2017. So now the pursuit from the patriotic side, from the humanity interested side, maybe is even a better way to say it, is to figure out, well, who actually coordinated this? Who wrote the programs? Who came up with the agendas? Where was this premeditated at? Who paid for it? What was involved and what occurred. And I think that particular process, quite frankly, Anina, has been going on for a number of years now. And we're moving into a more public revelatory period where a number of those issues and questions are going to be in the limelight before we get through this second or third, depending on how you want to call it, Trump presidency here in the world.
Yeah. And now that RFK Jr. has officially stepped into his role, we're going to see a lot on the medical and food side coming out, big pharma. So I think there's going to be a steady flow of information. And, hopefully this will shake people awake, because I think we need some sort of tipping point, obviously, on this planet. There's a certain percentage of a tipping point where we can affect the consciousness of everyone on the planet, but we need that certain percentage, to be able to, like, push it over the edge, so to speak, to be able to push it into a positive kind of timeline and shift everyone in that direction. At the same time, within this movement of truth and awakening, there's a lot of infiltrators as well. And, people need to really be careful. And I can see people around me, or, my audience, are getting better and better at it, discerning what's the truth and what not. Probably a couple of months ago, we were like, somebody says something, is like, oh dear, could that be true? Is that a possibility? And it's like something negative. And if we remember that we are created beings, like you rightfully said, then are we creating the timeline and the reality that the cabal wants us to create, by putting these, like, infiltrated voices, controlled opposition in the midst, and perhaps speaking 90% truth, but 10% of that is just leading people down the wrong path and causing them to create a reality that they themselves wouldn't have chosen, forgetting that they are the ones creating this reality. We are the ones collectively that create this reality. So I think it's also very important, it's important to be realistic and to look out for false flags and whatever, but it's just to know that, fear doesn't have a place in this spiritual war any longer. In fact, it's a big impediment, fear and doubt. And I get it. People have been fooled on this planet again and again and again, and people just don't want to be fooled again. So if something is said coming from a corner that perhaps they trusted or they think is legitimate, it's like, oh, okay, was I just fooled now? Is this really going in that transhumanist direction? Or have we all been fooled? And, But I think from what I see around me, people are getting a little bit better at discerning the truth and deciding what they want to focus on. At least the people kind of around me, but I don't think that's everywhere. And so it's just so important for people to really be extremely disciplined with who they listen to, who they lend an ear to, because immediately as that word is spoken, it comes into your mind, in your imagination, you picture that outcome, whether it's I don't know, false flag or some sort of negative event. And you actually, within 17 seconds, your mind starts manifesting that thought into a reality. And, when the quantum physics studies have shown that a particle is not there unless it's observed. So as soon as it's observed and there's a thought created about what that particle is, that particle starts taking that shape. So I think we need to really understand the importance of each and every person that is awake within this movement and the responsibility we have to, create a positive outcome, because indeed the white hats also rely on us. We are part of this movement, we are part of this war, and people just need to be very careful and very discerning who they listen to, and more than anything, learn to trust their intuition, their gut. Hear of something, when they hear someone speak, does it resonate? Does it ring true? Feel it in your body. If no, discard it immediately. Don't second guess yourself. We're such an important part of this mission now that it's so important to keep that in mind.
Well, you're branching into the quantum physics component of the human being here, and what ties back to what I call the Holy Spirit makeup that sustains our reality here in the world, and certainly sustains us as we move through that reality here in the world. I talked about bioresonance a moment ago. The only way that you can achieve something like bioresonance is if you acknowledge that the being that is exhibiting those particular qualities is resonating at some particular level. In other words, there has to be vibration, there has to be wavelength going on. We talked a moment ago about thoughts and electrical impulses and how those neurochemical impulses come together to produce a conscious thought. But what is actually happening at the subatomic and preatomic, what's called the quanta level inside the body, there is like vibrations are coming together in a magnetic form because the human being is expressing an electrochemical makeup that allows for wavelength, that allows for magnetism to generate that type of environment that causes that wavelength. And so if we surmise just a little bit further from that we have an electrical makeup that itself exhibits magnetism, vibration, and wavelength, then there must be some amount of calling or pushing away that occurs with how we are resonating here in the world. And the best way that I would characterize that for people out there is anytime that you've gone to, perhaps you've been traveling down the interstate and you've needed to stop off and fuel up a little bit and get some gas. I think they call it petrol in South Africa, and get the actual vehicle going again. And perhaps you need to also grab a couple of small items from the local convenient mart. And so you pull off. You've never been here before. This is the first place that this is the first time that you've gone to this particular place. And all of a sudden, all of the hair on the back of your neck begins to stand up. Perhaps you pull in and you look around and you realize this is not where I'd like to be. This does not feel good. There is some sort of intuitive feedback that's coming back to me about this. Many people describe that as women's intuition, or the intuition of the Holy Spirit sort of speaking to them in that moment. We're talking about the exact same process. The vibrational bioresonance of that particular human being is not symbiotic, is not harmonious with the vibrational resonance of the environment that they now find themselves in. So there is a revulsion, there is a repulse that happens there at that pre-atomic quanta level that I talked about a moment ago. And if it can happen in an environment just based on observation and physical placement, in other words, physical proximal exposure, would it not also be possible in the environment related back to our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, which themselves are bioresonant as well, and also characterized with frequency and wavelength? And I would submit, again, not being a quantum physicist, but I would submit that there is at least cause for a little bit of deliberateness and a little bit of concern there, because if that is so, that means that the environment around us may very well materialize in part because of our attitude, because of our disposition, and because of our overall belief structure that governs that bioresonance, which is a real measurable quality and trait of the human being.
Very well said. Very, very eloquently said. Thank you, SG. Um, on a positive note, we just news out of the UK that 900,000 people have cancelled their BBC license fee in 1 year. So clearly, and I know that recently there's been some damage to the building, glass doors broken, red paint thrown onto the walls. So, people are waking up. And I think in the UK, they've really been getting it from all sides, kind of forcing an awakening, if you will, with Starmer just making incredible statements that is hard to believe is true. Just a decade ago, nobody would have imagined anyone in power saying something like that so overtly. So that's good news. And also out of the Vatican, it looks like the Pope might be on his last legs finally. They're already seeding the narrative that he may not survive. His successors have been named, or the list at least, the short list. And so it looks like things are coming to a head, which is excellent news.
It is, and I'm anticipating that we're going to see again these escalations coming to a head in many more areas around the rest of the planet throughout this process and moving forward. Coming outward from the Western world, because the Hydra itself has been primarily concentrated inside the nation states of the Western world. We talk about the empire of the three cities, the Pope now being down, of course, which you mentioned a moment ago, potentially very, very sick and could pass away in this process before this is over. I believe the Pope is either 87 or 88 years old now. Both 88. Of those numbers are symbolic and significant. Thank you for that. So that's a significant number. Back to the Future, quite literally, the double infinity, right? This is literally symbolism being utilized in their face against them. It would not surprise me if we see the Pope pass away very soon and no clear line of succession conducted inside the Catholic Church, or perhaps an unusual or abnormal successory process that happens, one that has not happened in a very long time, potentially ever. And again, I'm sort of speculating on the hypothetical here because these are original, unprecedented times. There has never been a pope to preside over the bankruptcy, quite frankly, of the Vatican. There has never been a pope to preside over the destruction and the complete inversion of what has occurred with respect to that dark agenda inside the halls of Rome and the tunnel systems beneath the Italian peninsula over the last 1,000+ years. And so this is a period where we're going to see, I think, a number of events play out that will affect all of the local, regional, and international geopolitical areas of concern. We're talking about faith. We're talking about money. We're talking about concentration of political power. We're also talking about accountability, transparency, secrecy. A lot of individuals that are financially involved with the Catholic Church will certainly have a large axe to grind, if you will, with the core of the Vatican, and in particular the Vatican Bank and the financial institutions there, if they're all of a sudden out of a job, so to speak, with no significant transparency on how we arrived there, or no accountability for that being offered. And I think that's a period of time that we're probably likely to go through briefly, which is sort of this no man's land of what occurs when the Pope passes, what occurs when certain financial institutions in Western Europe experience major turndowns. I'm still expecting Deutsche Bank eventually to declare itself either insolvent or illiquid, which is going to, I think, impact the Eurozone very, very significantly through this process. Deutsche Bank is one of the largest banks in the world. It's also one of the Rothschilds' favorite banks. So when we look at the landscape and what's been happening here, we look at the spiritual side and that pulpit and concentrated area of control. We look at the financial side, the changeover is happening in that concentrated area of control. Now we look at what's happening inside Washington, D.C., just the complete public evisceration of all of the shadow state structures that have controlled the machinations of the U.S. Congress, the U.S. presidency, even the high court and the federal courts here across the land in the U.S. for a long time. This is an unprecedented situation, a constellation of convergence that has never occurred before. And we're going to see many tiny heads pop, so to speak, throughout this process, potentially beginning as early as April or May of this year, if not sooner.
Indeed. I'm just thinking of something else. There's been a lot of strawman comms with Donald Trump signing an executive order banning paper straws, which is clearly a com. I mean, why would something like that? It's not a priority. So a lot of people have sort of reported that means the straw man will be will be removed finally, and that those are our debt slavery bonds, right? Those are the things that have made us the slaves for so long. And ultimately, those bonds go to the Vatican, and they take the lion's share of what we are worth and what is being traded on the stock exchange. Um, and that goes to the Vatican. So perhaps now with Trump highlighting the strawman kind of issue, and with the Vatican, I don't know, let's just see something interesting. But I think the Vatican is a massive can of worms that will reveal so much deception that we've seen in the world. It's probably going to be too much for most people to handle. So they might do that slowly. I don't know. But, I just think the whole house of cards will come down if all of what has happened there and um, is exposed. And we're talking about satanic rituals and abuse happening underground and gold being stolen, and it's just so much. What do you think? Do you think there's any connection there?
I'm sorry the audio interrupted there at the last moment. Connection with pertaining to the underground and the revelations from the Vatican was, am I to understand the question correctly there?
I'm actually, yeah, I think more the straw man, being the birth bonds that is registered in each and every one of our names and then traded on the stock exchange and ultimately filed as a sister QV trust with the Vatican. And they take the lion's share of what each one of us are worth. Um, and with Trump talking about the straw man, with the paper straws being banned, that's clearly a com to say, I'm bringing the straw man up for disclosure. And with the Vatican perhaps coming into the sunlight as well, with the Pope, getting near to passing away, I'm just wondering if that's going to be something that will be revealed to the public as well, the straw man issue and the Vatican's role in that deception and debt slavery system.
It's a tall question. I think my initial impression of that, Anina, is going to be that the answer is yes, but that's going to be a gradual process because people will have to understand and accept and grapple with other large components of the awakening process first. You're talking about, someone realizing that the entirety of their life's work, the substance that they've produced with the work of their hands and the energy and effort that they've expended with their life force energy has essentially been completely siphoned off and stored somewhere else and utilized for all sorts of criminality all around the planet. That's a difficult realization to come to. We're absolutely seeing comms pertaining to the straw man, the corporate structure here in the USA, going from paper to plastic, right? So from the natural world to the oil world, with that particular relationship, and who was the oil baron here in the U.S. for a long time? Well, that was the Rockefeller family, the same family that assisted in both the creation of the Federal Reserve in the early 20th century, and then the heist of all of the remaining U.S. gold, sort of sealing the deal for the fate of the United States of America financially, beginning in the 70s and moving forward towards the closeout of the 20th century. So I think we're absolutely seeing reference to that. The Vatican timing on that is very highly apropos as far as I'm concerned. And we talked about that just a second ago. The Vatican Bank itself talking about potential insolvency and running low on issue and potentially having to declare bankruptcy. These were narratives that were cast just over the last couple of months with respect to newspaper articles that have been published and online periodicals that have been published from that area of the world. So I think you're seeing a broader narrative build up for what has actually happened with the substance of we the people. And that will likely lead into, well, how in the world was this possible, which is the introductory pathway for the straw man concept, the corporate concept, right? Going back to the early days, the very, very early days of the American Republic, think 1795, 1797, there was an early Supreme Court precedent case set here in the USA. And I think it was a case out of Georgia, actually, the state of Georgia at the time, essentially describing that a living man or woman could not contract with an artificial business entity and act in that entity's stead as one and the same, because it's simply not possible. And the government itself is only allowed to contract with artificial or dead entities. So corporations, things of economic interaction, things of commerce, but not directly with the living men and women, the sovereigns that stand upon the soil. Well, that case precedent has been completely and totally eviscerated over the last 185 years or so here in the United States of America, really a little bit longer than that. And that's going to have to be adjudicated. That's going to have to be reverted and brought forward and made right, because that is a sitting, unchallenged, never repealed Supreme Court precedent that has been set here in the USA that has just been completely and patently ignored. And that's not allowed in a society where there is a common law system, where there is a Republican form that allows for the redress of grievances up to the nation state national level. And when the high court in the land makes a decision, that is the decision, whether we like it or not. And that's part of what allows us to come together in a republic and live both with our individual rights respected, but also with the betterment of the majority and the greater good for the collective always maintained in mind. So I know this is a long answer to the question, but fundamentally the answer is yes, but probably not in the way that many of us would like. We would love to see a national broadcast where Trump simply addresses the nation and says, hey, have you ever heard of the Act of 1871? Well, here's what really happened, and moving through that. And that's not going to happen, because you have to remember we're playing to an audience of more than 340 million here in the United States, just the United States alone. It's an audience of more than 1.5 billion in the Western world. And so that audience has to come around in their own way, in their own fashion, in their own time, collectively and in alignment with one another, organically, to the realization of what's happened here. So yes, I think we're going to see the introduction of those issues probably here during this particular Trump administration. It may take us some time to get all the way there, but before this process is over, Anina, we know that we will have to arrive at the major talking points of this issue we're talking about, because that is how we revert back to a constitutional Republican system. We've lived in a corpocracy in the Western world for more than 150 years in its current form, really more than 200 years when we talk about the overseas colonies and territories and possessions of the former British Royal Empire. And so that has to come around to the discussion of, well, what is a living man? What is a living person? What are the real restrictions on things like economic extortion? What are the real restrictions on taxation? And what precedent do we already have set in U.S. law, certainly pre-Civil War, but even post-Civil War in some regards? What precedent already exists to show that we have to move out of a corporate system and back into a Republican system of accountability? I think we're going to see those discussions develop in the coming weeks, months, and years.
Hmm. Very exciting indeed. It's about time. So yeah, I can see all of those coming together with going back to the organic republic, the restored republic. So all of these sort of things have to align and will come into the public narrative. But yeah, I agree it's going to take some time. It's not something that can be dropped on the public at large just at once. They have to be desensitized to the issue. It's got to slowly sort of sink into the narrative. Um, but yeah, coming to the surface, it will. I think we have no doubt about that. Just to segue a little bit, we spoke before, I think before we started recording the talks going on in Riyadh, or that has happened in Riyadh in the past day or so. Um, between Trump, not Trump, but the US, Putin, and what's the war in Ukraine? What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting with respect to that particular meeting that's getting ready to happen between President Trump and President Putin, and apparently Zelensky is not going to participate in these talks, despite actually being given a retroactive offer to go ahead and participate, and declining that, which I find very, highly interesting and very telling. One of the major components I think that's going to come out of this is not just the discussion of the Ukraine war, but how do we refinance and repurpose some of these markets, both in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, as well as North America, that have been essentially strained to their maximum limitation, their maximum ability to absorb that strain without totally collapsing by that particular war, and other conflicts as well that have broken off around the world, right? We've seen a divorce, quite frankly, from the US dollar on behalf of more than 65% of the entirety of the population of the planet. So that's going to be a topic of conversation in Riyadh, simply because it can't not be. We're talking about one of the largest foreign investors, being Saudi Arabia, one of the largest foreign investors in the world with respect to international projects. Saudi Arabia also is known to have tremendous amounts of gold and precious metals and treasures that have been stored up over a period of many, many decades, and really going back a couple of hundred years when we look at the old Arabian kingdom. And so that entire that entire landscape is going to be relevant to what's going on in Ukraine now, to what economic impacts are going to be allowed and expected by Moscow, by the BRICS nations overall. You have essentially two of the largest powers inside the BRICS nations coming together with the U.S. president right now on this particular issue. The fact that China is not at this meeting, I find, is very, very interesting in its own right, but that's a whole other topic for another time. But fundamentally, I think that we're going to see come from this particular meeting an action plan not just for Ukraine and Eastern Europe, but also an action plan to bring transparency to worldwide economic behavior, worldwide financial markets. It would not surprise me if this forum becomes the vector by which President Putin simply introduces to President Trump and the world the concept of dark money laundering and off book black budget projects that have been going on in that area that the Russian military has discovered. We know that the newly confirmed director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has been on video, both herself personally and then in interviews, discussing the fact that Russia probably wouldn't have such a big problem in Ukraine if all of our biological laboratories weren't over there. So this is someone who understands that the intelligence community's behavior in that area of the world is partially what is driving this, and that intelligence community has to be getting funding from somewhere, and it's not just from USAID, although USAID is a major faction and a major player in that. So I'm very excited for what comes out of this meeting. Ben Salman went on a world tour of his own in, I believe, 2018, shortly after him and President Trump had met in Las Vegas, where they attempted to assassinate Ben Salman, and he essentially told all of the major business moguls, the very large magnates inside the Western world and inside the international community, what types of changes were going to be spearheaded by the figurehead political leaders that were, acting in concert with one another, Putin, Xi, Ben Salman, POTUS, and others, and we could spend all day talking about what that looked like. But fundamentally, this was a world tour on behalf of the Crown Prince to advise all of the major worldwide financial and business players that changes were coming, and these changes were going to permanently augment the system, and they needed to make the right choice and get on the right side of history. So I'm very excited to see what comes from this particular meeting. We now have these minds coming back together publicly for the first time in a number of years. It's probably going to be a check-in on a great deal of the progress that's been made with respect to worldwide financial changeover, as well as the issue of Ukraine and how do we stop the situation in the Middle East as well from devolving into a much larger and broader conflict before this is over for the exact same reasons.
Yeah, things are definitely moving in the right direction. And, when everything that has been happening in the Ukraine comes out, the biolabs, the trafficking, the experimentation, it's going to be a big one. And I think people that expect this to happen all overnight, for this major spiritual war to be over in a blink of an eye, is not really realistic. We have to be patient. We've got to wait for all this to play out. We've got to trust that things are happening in the best way that they can. And in the meantime, not sit around and wait for things to happen to us, but actually work on ourselves so that we can contribute in a positive way to this spiritual war. Because, as I said before, we are part and parcel of this movement and this war, and we have a role to play, and we have to make sure that we make the most of that. So yeah, it's been great discussing all this current events with you, SG Anon. Any last thoughts that you want to share with us? And, where can people find you?
Well, my last thoughts, I think, would be that because we're now, into a period of time where the irregular war is happening concurrent with our awareness of it. In other words, we're not attempting to go and determine what President Trump or what the military alliance around the world or what the geopolitical market behavior around the world is going to do in response to things that have already occurred, because they're now occurring organically again in real time under this next Trump administration. I think that is something that we should do well to remember, because that war does not end just because we have President Trump back in office. In fact, on the 30th of January, Trump himself told us at a press conference with the White House press room in response to the aircraft event from the 29th of January that this was a major chess game with moves being made at the highest levels. And I'm quoting there. So that particular reference is clearly a reference to a broader conflict a broader power struggle that's been going on is still going on and is entering a new phase now that President Trump is successfully back in the office of the presidency publicly and visibly for the world to see. I'm very excited for what comes from this particular period of time that we're living in, Anina. I think we're going to move extremely rapidly towards not only awakening our fellow brothers and sisters with all of this, but also fundamentally and physically transforming how we conduct ourselves and live and do business with each other here in the world. But that process is also rife, I think, in many regards with some riskiness and some a need for us to maintain that vigilance, but from a place of peaceability and encouragement rather than a place of discouragement and fear and worry, right? An army that is winning the war believes itself to have won the war in its mind first. And that's where we're going, I think, with all of this, is we have to realize we are winning. We are moving that needle forward. This is categorically us swamping and overtaking them, but there's still going to be some resistance along the way. And that's okay, because it will help us define what we want on the other side of this even better and more concisely is what I'm trying to say there. And perhaps even in a more detailed and thorough way, which is something we all want and need to reestablish trust here in the world. It's going to be a very, very fun time. I would just encourage everyone to hang in there. And then with respect to my own handles, I can be found in 4 places online. The Q News audio podcast is found on rumble.com/user/Q News Patriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SG Anon. And I can be found in 3 other places for social media outreach: TruthSocial, X, and Telegram. I'm on TruthSocial at the handle Real, REAL, SG Anon with a red check mark. I can be found on Telegram at the handle t.me/real, REAL, Q News Patriot on Telegram. And I can be found on X, formerly Twitter, at the handle THE, Q News Patriot with a blue check mark.
Thank you for clarifying that, because there are so many fake channels around. So yeah, everyone, I'll leave the links below as well. And thank you so much, SG, for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your analysis. It's always valuable, it's always helpful, and it's always a pleasure chatting to you. The darkness is sitting in here, it's evening here, but yeah, again, we appreciate it so much, and wishing you best of luck with the journey ahead. I'm sure we'll touch base in a couple of weeks or months' time again. And yeah, let's just be excited for the times that we are in. We're moving in the right direction, and it's important not to lose sight of that. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, SG.
God bless all.
Bye.